Hi, it's Dr. Howard Hurst here with another session as part of my series on nutrition for junior athletes. If you haven't seen the other videos yet, then go and check them out on my YouTube channel. But in this session, we're going to look specifically at nutrition for growth and development and performance. Okay, so to start with, we'll have a quick look over growth and development. So typically, youth athletes like yourselves are less mechanically efficient compared to us adults. So as an example, for a given intensity, children tend to require somewhere between 20 and 30% more oxygen than adults for that same given exercise intensity. So when we look at our total daily energy expenditure, TDEE, we need to make sure that there's enough energy left over for this growth and development, okay? And that will differ, that total daily energy expenditure will differ according to age, how developed you are, how muscular you are, your body mass, but then also what type of sport you do, what position you play in that sport. For example, within football, goalkeepers will have considerably different total daily energy expenditure compared to, say, an outfield player, but also the duration and the intensity of which those sports are playing for. So there's quite a lot of factors that feed into our total daily energy expenditure. But with regards to growth and development, we need to make sure that once we've factored in that exercise, or what we call physical activity energy expenditure, there's enough energy left to support our growth and development. And that energy that's left is called energy availability. So an energy availability less than 30 kilocalories per kilogram of what we call fat-free mass per day, that can have a negative effect on how well you grow and how well you develop. And that can affect things like bone growth, delayed puberty, reduced bone mineral density, so the bones aren't as strong, immune function, and then in females, it can also affect menstrual function. So it has a considerable knock-on effect to that growth and development. Now, whilst there's not a huge amount of research available at the minute on energy availability in children, we do know that for adults, anything or an absolute minimum recommendation is 45 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day. Okay, so given that yourselves are going through an intense growth period, then we can assume that the energy availability that needs to be left after factoring everything else in that we do in our day should be an absolute minimum of 45 kilocalories. It's probably likely to be a little bit higher. Now, one thing that we do know from various different studies, and I'll show you an example in a couple of slides' time, is children of your age often don't meet the energy requirements for growth and development, so they don't have enough energy left. And one of the reasons for this is because quite often, and the same occurs in adults, but to a lesser extent because we've generally finished growing, but in children, we tend to prioritize performance over growth and development. So when we look back to the previous session where we looked at nutrition around match day preparation, I think there tends to be an emphasis on that more so than the nutrition for general feeding, general daily life, and that subsequent growth. Okay, so with respect to the different classes of nutrients, I don't want to spend too long on this because I'm sure you've probably come across this before, but we've got carbohydrates, fats and protein, and then we've got vitamins, minerals and water. So we can class the carbohydrates, fats and proteins as macronutrients, so we need a reasonable amount of those, and then vitamins, minerals and water, although water's possibly slightly misleading, we can class as micronutrients because we need those in relatively small quantities compared to the macronutrients. Okay, so with the respect to the balance of these macronutrients, then current guidelines by Public Health England recommend 50% or approximately 50% of your daily intake should come from carbohydrates, 35% from fats with less than 10% from saturated fat, and then 15% there or thereabouts from protein. Now we know that these will differ slightly depending on different sports, but we can generally take these as a midpoint for most activities. Now, there are some issues with determining your calorie intake as a percentage. Okay, so this 50% carbs, 35% fats, 15% protein. You could quite feasibly hit those percent targets absolutely bang on, yet still be either under eating or overeating. And this is why counting calories as a percentage is sometimes problematic. To give you an example of that, this was a study that was done a while back on youth football players, and they looked at energy intake versus energy expenditure. So we can see, hopefully you can see on the slide here, that when the researchers looked at the energy intake as a percentage, then the players, these were youth football players, were meeting the percent recommendations pretty much bang on. Yet when they looked at those as grams per kilogram body mass, there were approximately 700 to 800 kilocalories under eating every day. And we can see that from this graph on the right hand side of this slide. So energy expenditure, we can see varied somewhere between 3,200 calories and just short of 4,000 kilocalories. But when we look at the energy intake of those players, all of them bar two were significantly under eating. So this demonstrates why using percent macronutrients as a guide to your nutrition can be a little bit misleading. So I would recommend for you guys to always look at the grams per kilogram that you're consuming. So again, in terms of match day preparation, go back to the session that we did previously and have a look at the recommendations I made in there, and they're all in grams per kilogram muscle mass. Kilograms body mass. So taking those points into consideration, how much should we be eating then to make sure we're getting enough energy in to support that growth and development? Well, if we look at these two tables here, we can see we've got age 4 to 8, 9 to 13, and 14 to 18 years of age. And I've put these down for males. I do apologise for any of the females. The females are a little bit less, on average roughly about 200 kilocalories less. And then we've got activity levels down here. So for sedentary, so doing no exercise, for you guys at the age that you are, you should be having somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 if you're doing no exercise. Now we know that's not the case with you guys because you're very active, you do a lot of sport per week, so you need to be having more than that. So if your activity levels are moderate, then somewhere between 1,800 to 2,200 for 9 to 13 year olds, and up to around 2,800 thereabouts for 14 to 18 year olds. Now, speaking to your teachers and looking at how much activity you do per week, I would probably argue that you guys and girls are in the very active category. Therefore, in terms of how much energy intake you should be consuming, for 9 to 13 year olds, that can be as much as 2,600 kilocalories. And for 14 to 18 year olds, that can be as much as 3,500 kilocalories. Now, to put that into some sort of perspective, the average total daily energy intake for an adult male is somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500, and for females between 1,600 and 2,000 calories. Okay, so we can see that you guys should be consuming quite a lot more than adults, and the reason for that is because of that growth phase that you were going through. We've finished puberty, we've come out to the other side. By and large, we've generally stopped growing, so we don't need that much energy. You guys are going through that, and it's a very energy intensive process. Similarly, we can use growth height and mass per year as a rough indicator of whether you are developing at roughly the right rate. So again, in terms of mass per year, for 9 to 13-year-olds, you should be putting on an average of around 4 kilos per year. And then for 14 to 19-year-olds, that can be as much as 19.5 kilos per year, okay? Because as we get to that sort of mid to late point in puberty, we see, particularly with males, a significant increase in testosterone production, and therefore we can see these significant increases in the development of muscle mass. Similar with height, then roughly about 6.5 centimeters per year for 9 to 13-year-olds, and anywhere between 9.5 and 10.5 centimeters per year for 14 to 18-year-olds. Okay, so moving on to carbohydrates then. I mentioned on the previous slides that total daily energy intake should be around 50%, and I alluded to that being the midpoint. So depending on your type of activity, the intensity, the duration, etc., that should fall somewhere between around 45 and 60% of your total daily energy intake. And if we have a look at this table here, we can see that depending on the exercise intensity, that will dictate how much carbohydrate you should be consuming. So for low intensity sessions or skill-based sessions, then you should be aiming for around 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram of body mass. And that also applies for general feeding and recovery days. So certainly on the recovery days, probably towards the lower end of that. For moderate intensity sessions, so somewhere between 1 to 2 hours, then around 5 to 7 kilograms per kilogram body mass. High intensity or longer endurance sessions, 6 to 10 grams per kilogram. And then if it's a competition day or you've got multiple training sessions or multiple PE sessions during a day, then that can be anywhere between 8 and 12 grams per kilogram body mass. Now, in terms of whether we should carbohydrate load prior to training or prior to a match, then for those 15 years and upwards, that's fine. And if we go back to the previous talk that I gave, then we mentioned that competition day feeding or match day feeding should start around 2 days before. For those of you who are under 15 years of age, then you don't need to do that. Okay, and the reason being is because at your age, you have a much lower ability to store carbohydrates than when you are older and adults. So as a result of that, carbohydrate loading a couple of days before a match or a training session isn't really going to do anything because you're just not going to store it and you're just going to pass it out. You guys at that age are much more fat adapted. Unfortunately, when we get older, we become very much less fat adapted, hence why we tend to start putting more weight on as we get older. So for those of you under 15 years of age, then I would just adopt a normal carbohydrate feeding strategy, okay, based on these exercise intensities, but you don't need to carbohydrate load. For those of you who are older than that, then your ability to store carbohydrates is largely dependent on muscle storage size. Okay, so the bigger you are, the more muscles you have, the more you will be able to store that carbohydrate. So either way, we need to make sure that there's adequate carbohydrates for those higher intensity sessions, but particularly so for the younger players, because you're not having that opportunity or shouldn't be taking that opportunity to carbohydrate load beforehand. So you need to make sure you're having enough just before, so the pre-training meal. Make sure you get adequate carbohydrate in that, and then if the session dictates, have a carbohydrate drink during the session. So looking at those different exercise intensities and carb intakes on the previous slide, what does that actually translate to in the real world? Well, here we've presented three different players, a 60 kilo player, an 80 kilo player, and a 100 kilo player. So that should pretty much cover the full range of 9-year-olds up to about 18-year-olds. Okay, yes, there are exceptions, and some may be lighter than that, some may be heavier, but by and large, these three weight categories will probably cover most of you. So for a low intensity training day or a rest day, for a 60 kilo player, if we take the midpoint in those ranges on the previous slide, so 3 to 5 kilograms, if we take that midpoint of 4 grams, then that equates to 240 grams of carbohydrate for a 60 kilo player per day. For an 80 kilo player, 320, and for a 100 kilo player, 400 grams of carbohydrates per day for a low intensity session or rest day. If it's a moderate intensity training session, again, if we take the midpoint, 5 to 7 grams, then 6 grams multiplied by 60 kilos is 360 grams, 480 grams for an 80 kilo player, and 600 grams for a 100 kilo player. And then for a heavy day or a match day, again, around 480 grams for a 60 kilo player, 640 and 800 grams respectively for the 80 and 100 kilo player. Now we can see when we get up to 100 kilos, match day, that's quite a lot of carbohydrates. 800 grams of carbohydrates is quite significant. So therefore, to try and eat that amount pre-game, certainly, I mean, that 800 grams is over the whole day, I should say. But pre-game, you could be having around 250 grams of carbohydrates. Some of that you might want to consider having liquid, so a carbohydrate drink, just to ease stress on the stomach. Okay, so we can break carbohydrates down loosely into two types: simple sugars and complex sugars, or simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. So simple sugars are fructose, sucrose, glucose. Okay, they can't be broken down into any smaller form, and these tend to be found in more refined foods such as cereals, chocolate bars, white breads, things like that. And they cause a large elevation in blood glucose levels. So the body then has to rely on the release of insulin to remove that blood glucose from the blood into the muscles and into the liver. And there's very limited nutritional value from these simple sugars, and if we have too much of them, then that can get stored in the fat cells, converted into adipose or fat tissue, and it can also have a knock-on effect on cholesterol. However, from an exercise perspective, they are beneficial because of that rapid spike in blood glucose or hyperglycemia. Then they have benefit during exercise and post-exercise because it gets the sugar into the body very rapidly where we need it, and then we can use it for exercise or for recovery. On the other hand, complex carbohydrates are made up of much longer strings of carbohydrates and also contain starch. And these tend to take a lot longer to break down, and therefore they have a much slower impact on blood glucose levels. So we don't see the same rapid spike in that blood glucose, and therefore the same big release of insulin. And as a result of that, it has a far less impact on cholesterol levels and health. So these are found in whole grain foods, fruits, vegetables, things like that. Are they beneficial for exercise? Yeah, certainly. It depends on the type of exercise that you're doing. Certainly pre-exercise session or match, then complex carbohydrates are better because they provide a more trickle effect, if you like, for that carbohydrates to get into the system. And if we've got very long exercise durations, then some complex carbohydrates can be beneficial then. Now, for you guys, you're probably not going to be doing exercise of that kind of duration where complex carbs would be of any real benefit to you, but certainly pre-training or pre-match, they are useful, and I'll explain a little more in a second. Okay, so the glycemic index relates to how quick foods cause this big spike in blood glucose. So the glycemic index is a scale from 0 to 100, with 100 being very fast acting. So foods that have a high glycemic index cause blood sugars to spike rapidly. Foods with a low glycemic index cause blood sugars to rise much more slowly. So anything below 59 is classed as low GI. 60 to 69 is classed as moderate GI, and anything above 70 is classed as high GI. So glucose is always used as the base value. Okay, that is a GI of 100, so that causes blood sugars to rise as quickly as possible. Okay, so everything else is compared to that. So if you have a look at this table here, we can see some examples. So breads, so types of bread, mixed grain breads, low GI, seeded breads, chapatis, bran, things like that, are all very low in glycemic index. So they'll have a very slow, they'll cause blood glucose to rise slowly. Moderate type GI breads, wholemeal breads, pita breads, croissants, crumpets, things like that. And then breads that cause blood glucose to rise rapidly, white breads, gluten-free white breads, bagels, things like that. And this table kind of breaks down a number of different foods for that. So you've got different breakfast cereals, grains, biscuits, fruits, typical dairies, things like that. Now, this is a relatively small snapshot of those types of foods. If you go onto Google and just type into the search bar glycemic index foods or glycemic index charts, something like that, it'll bring up a whole host of different tables that you can go and have a look at. So you can compare the foods that you're currently eating. You probably found them in one of the tables on Google somewhere. So how does this fit into our training and match days? Well, as I said on the previous slide, pre-training or pre-match, we want low glycemic index foods or low to moderate glycemic index foods, because we don't want that rapid increase at that time point. Okay. During your training sessions or during your match, that's when you want the high GI foods, because you want rapid increase in blood glucose. So you get that big insulin spike to take that glucose out of the blood into the muscles and into the liver. So for example, on a match day or for a training day, could be as well, a couple of hours before, 3 to 4 hours before, have a low to moderate GI meal. About an hour before, if you still feel you need to have something, you can have a high GI snack. Okay. During your session, for you guys, water is more than enough. You don't necessarily need to be having energy drinks unless it's a longer training session. Excuse me. And then post-training or post-match, then you want the high GI foods again, because we want to recover as quickly as possible. So we want to get that blood glucose, that sugar out of the blood and into the muscles. Okay. Okay, so for protein, you should be aiming to have around 15 to 25% of your total daily calorie intake coming from quality protein sources. Research has shown that athletic children require more protein than their non-athletic counterparts. So typically, children will require somewhere between 1 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body mass, whereas very active athletic children require somewhere between 1.4 and 1.7. And we can see from this table here, there's a range of different body masses and their associated range of proteins based on that 1.4 to 1.7 grams per kilogram. Another thing that we should start to think about doing is moving away from the traditional breakfast, lunch, evening meal eating strategies. And instead, we want to try and spread our protein intake out over the whole of the day. So typically we want to try and be eating something protein based every 3 to 4 hours. So with each of those sittings, you should be aiming for somewhere between 15 to 20 grams. So I would recommend, I normally split it over 6 meals. You can do it more if you wanted to, but I tend to stick to 6 meals: breakfast, lunch, evening dinner, and then a morning snack, an afternoon snack, and a pre-bed snack. And the timing of those snacks can differ slightly depending on when your training might be. The timing of protein ingestion is also important for its function. So with young athletes, we should try to encourage them to consume protein with breakfast. And I know it's often a challenge to try and get young children to eat breakfast anyway, but we should be trying to get them to eat protein with their breakfast, because that can help to improve protein nitrogen balance, and that's important for growth and development. And overnight, that net protein balance can drop into the negative. And this study here by Karagounis and co, they looked at the effect of different quantities of protein ingestion on that net protein balance. And the bars that we're really interested in here are these dark black bars. So overnight, as I said, protein net balance can drop to negative. With zero protein, as expected, there's very little change in net protein balance. But then with subsequent doses, 7, 14 and 21 grams with breakfast, we saw a significant increase in that net balance with increasing load. So ideally, and again, we can see from this graph here, that 21 grams was the optimal, or not necessarily optimal, certainly best within this study. And that feeds into what I said on the previous slide about trying to have about 15 to 20 grams with each meal. Moving on to fats next. Fat often gets a bad reputation, and we're told that it causes all sorts of cardiovascular disease, high cholesterol, obesity, things like that. And to an extent that is true. However, we still need around 25 to 30% of our daily calories coming from good fats because it is an essential nutrient and it provides a good source of energy. It is the biggest source of energy within the body. Even in very lean people, it still provides the most amount of energy for us. And at rest, that is the main energy source that we are using. But it's also important to help absorption of what we call fat-soluble vitamins. It provides omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, produces steroid hormones, and it also helps to conserve body heat. So it has a role of essential functions within the body, but I think the key thing with fats is good education and teaching children what are the good sources of fats and what types of fats we should be avoiding, such as saturated and trans fats. And it's also important to bear in mind that certainly for the younger children who are more fat adapted, so prior to puberty, children tend to be more fat adapted, so they will use their fat stores more effectively than adults do. It can provide a good source of energy for exercise of low to moderate intensity, up to around 60 minutes. So we really shouldn't be hung up about trying to reduce fats. And personally, I think at this age, children shouldn't really be looking at having low fat, fat-free options, because quite often those products have a higher sugar and salt content. So unless there is a real reason for them to go on a low-fat, fat-free diet, then really they should be just having normal full-fat products, full-fat dairy products at least. So plenty of mono polyunsaturated fats and less saturated, and try to reduce your trans fats as much as possible. And with respect to the different types of fat, this image here just shows some of the different types of solid fats and oils and the makeup of saturated fats, monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So as I said on the previous slide, we should be able to have more mono and polyunsaturated fats. So if we look at this image, we can see coconut oil is very high in saturated fat, and we could get into a whole session on its own about whether coconut oil is good or whether it's bad or not. Yes, it's more stable at higher temperatures, so it has a higher flash point, but ultimately it is still very high in saturated fat. Now, I'm not saying don't use it at all, but I would use it sparingly, okay? And any athletes that I work with, I tend to say, yes, use it, but don't use it all the time. In terms of oils, then the best ones to use are canola oil, safflower oil, good quality sunflower oils, extra virgin olive oils, because they all are higher in mono and polyunsaturated fats. Moving on to vitamins and minerals, relatively briefly, I don't want to spend too long on this. If you have a balanced diet in place, then by and large, you should be getting enough of all the key vitamins and minerals that you need. Where this may differ is if certain foods or certain food groups have been restricted in the diet, that can lead to low levels. But to be clear, a low level doesn't constitute a deficiency. A deficiency or a clinical deficiency takes extended periods of time to develop and is more serious. But just by taking certain foods out of diet can mean we can be a little bit short on certain vitamins and minerals. But as I said, by and large, if you've got a good balanced diet, you should be getting most of those. Some that do tend to be a little bit low are calcium. So if you don't consume enough dairy, then your calcium levels can be a little bit low, and that's important for bone growth, particularly as we're going through puberty. So ensuring you get enough dairy or dairy alternatives. So one thing to consider there is milk, a lot of calcium in milk. If you are either lactose intolerant or you're vegan, then almond milks, soy milks, things like that, dairy alternatives, they do have calcium in, but tend to be in relatively low quantities. So that's something that if you are vegan, you may need to consider. Iron is another one that tends to be low, more so in females than males due to periods, but that can be as low as 40 to 50% and will change throughout the year, month by month, depending on the phase of the menstrual cycle. And then also zinc, that can be sometimes be a little bit low. So if you fall into those categories, then there are a couple of key vitamins and minerals that you might want to consider keeping an eye on, and you may want to supplement if you can't get enough through alternative sources. Now, one vitamin that I would probably make exception with in terms of supplementing is vitamin D, particularly if we live, or sort of say, particularly if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, where sunlight is often limited, particularly in winter months, then a vitamin D supplement is often a good thing, okay? It's quite hard to get enough vitamin D through food alone. We can get it through things like eggs, but that alone is probably not going to meet your daily vitamin D requirements, which is around 15 micrograms. And that's because vitamin D is generally synthesized in the skin. It's produced in the skin as a result of exposure to sunlight. With the majority of athletes, both young and old, that I've worked with over the years, I've found that pretty much most of them have been on the lower end of the vitamin D intake side. So a daily supplement of 1000 IUs or 25 micrograms is probably suitable. And in case you're wondering what the recommended intake levels are for various vitamins and minerals, there's two tables here, so I'm not going to go through each one of these. You can pause the video and you can have a look at those in your own time. Okay, so taking everything into account that we've just covered, what does that look like over an example day? Well, here's two example menu plans, one for an athlete whose target intake is around 2,000 calories per day, and one for an athlete whose target is around 3,500 calories per day. So pretty much at the opposite ends of the scale, one early puberty and one more towards late puberty. Okay, you'll see from both of these examples, I've split the plans down into those 6 meals that I talked about. So the breakfast, the lunch, the evening meal, and then in the morning, an afternoon, and a pre-bed snack. I've also included something in and around training. That will largely depend on the type of training that's being done and the duration of that training. So if it's an hour session, then for children, water is perfectly fine, or maybe if it's warm with the addition of an electrolyte tablet. If it's over an hour, then we can start to think about including a little bit of carbohydrate. In terms of the types of foods, you'll see that with each meal, I've tried to include that 20 grams roughly of protein, some good fats, and some good sources of carbohydrates. One thing to consider as well is because these are for school children, possibly less so with college, university age children. They have a little bit more flexibility, but certainly at school age, high school, junior school age, one thing to think about is the breaks or lack of breaks that they get. So the opportunities to feed are often limited during the day. So what you might want to do is load up the lunch a little bit more, so give them a little bit more for the lunch, and that will then take away the requirement to eat large quantities at the morning and afternoon snack. So they can just have a quick snack, 20 grams of, if they take some like mixed nuts or something, as we can see in this example, or a banana, and they can just eat that quickly between classes. So I hope you found this session useful. If you'd like to get more information, then we will be going through that in some of the other sessions, but I go into more depth on a lot of these topics in my book, Nutrition for Junior Athletes, a practical guide for parents and coaches. And you can get that both in paperback and ebook via Amazon, or you can download it, you can purchase it via the link on my Linktree page. You can see the web address for that there. Thanks for listening, and hopefully you'll tune into some of the next sessions.